Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 109 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on fair Verona, but peace in the city has recently been disturbed by new discord between two noble households who bear an ancient grudge. Young men, servants and gentlemen alike, from the rival houses of Capulet and Montague, roam the streets in search of quarrel. It is not long before fighting breaks out, only halted by the ruling prince, who is enraged by this civil strife and issues stern warnings to both leaders. The eldest Montague son, Romeo, did not take part in this latest fray, for he has been eschewing social company, distracted by the self-conscious melancholy of an unrequited love. This very night, however, Romeo will be persuaded to attend a party at the rival Capulets, where a sudden but seismic moment of enchantment will change his destiny and that of both families. This is, of course, the start of what is arguably the most famous love story of all time, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The tragic tale of the young lovers who fall deeply in love at first sight and in a mad rush seek to defy their families to be together is probably Shakespeare's most popular play, not only in the theatre, but also in the countless forms it has been retold, in musicals, dance, opera, and film. Its pull has been powerful ever since it was first published. In the copy of the 1623 folio edition of Shakespeare's plays, held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the play that shows the most physical wear is Romeo and Juliet, and its most read scene, the lovers' first meeting. Romeo and Juliet's ecstatic young love and their terrible fate has become iconic, a model for romantic plot lines in any setting or time. As it happens, I am just back from a visit to Verona, where the lovers' names live on in innumerable bogus forms and still draw millions to pay homage. As we record this episode, a typically daring new production of the play, directed by Robery Icke, is playing in London's West End, with Sadie and Noah Jupe starring as the doomed couple. I'm delighted to have this production as a prompt to cover the play, and even more excited to be able to welcome a proper expert to guide us through it, Shakespearean scholar Dr. Hester Lees-Jeffries. Hester is a director of studies in English at Cambridge University, where she specializes in Shakespeare and early modern drama. For our specific purposes, she is the author of the introduction to the third edition of the new Cambridge Shakespeare of Romeo and Juliet. Welcome, Hester. Thank you so much for joining me on the Play Podcast.
That's a pleasure, Douglas. Thank you for the invitation.
So my first question is, where does Romeo and Juliet fit into the chronology of Shakespeare's career, and what was going on at the time in his career and the world that influenced the play he wrote then?
So this is at a really important and interesting moment in Shakespeare's development as a writer, and particularly as a playwright. It's in the middle of the 1590s, so it's 1595, and it comes at a point in his professional career where he is writing almost for the first time for a stable company of actors whom he knows, and for a known theatrical space, the theatre, and that counts for a lot. But it's also at a moment in his career when the theatres have been closed for quite a lot of the previous couple of years by plague. And usually academics look at that and say, well, that's when he wrote his big long poems, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. But also it's clear that he was doing a lot of reading and probably a lot of writing. And three plays that he wrote, which appeared for the first time in 1595, all seem to overlap in interesting ways. And those are Midsummer Night's Dream and Richard II and Romeo and Juliet. And so the idea that he's writing these plays for actors he knows, a theatre that he knows, at the same time experimenting with different effects, different kinds of poetry. It's a really important moment in his professional and poetic career. But as well as those plague closures that had been going on in London, London is a tricky place at this point in the mid-1590s. The mid-1590s, there has been terrible weather in England for the last few years. There have been terrible harvests, and there's actually famine in some parts of the country. And in London, there have been a series of riots over the price of food. There have been apprentices executed for their part in those riots. And so the sense of a city which could explode, a kind of tinderbox with young people in particular who are very upset, potentially out of control, potentially given to violence, is a very live one when Shakespeare is writing Romeo and Juliet. And I think that's a kind of energy which is reflected in this play that we mightn't necessarily think of. That yes, it's Verona, but it's also very much London. It's a play about being in a city which is actually quite on edge.
Ah, yeah. You talked about the coincidence with A Midsummer Night's Dream, or possibly even Love's Labour's Lost. It was at the same time. Is it near that?
It's close. The dating of Love's Labour's Lost is slightly tricky, whether it came before or after Romeo and Juliet, but it's absolutely bang on with Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you think about Midsummer Night's Dream and the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, it's Romeo and Juliet again. And so the idea that Shakespeare can do a comic version of this story in Midsummer Night's Dream and a tragic version of the same story in Romeo and Juliet, he knows he's good. He knows that he can really pull this off, almost parodying himself in one play that might be played in rep with Romeo and Juliet.
Oh.
I think he knows he's really cooking.
Wow. Okay, so he either wrote them simultaneously or one after the other?
Yeah.
And there are elements of comedy in Romeo and Juliet, surprisingly. That's not what we think of. But it starts in a quite comic vein in some way, albeit, as you say, with some edge to it. But there's, the banter between the men, the nurse's role and her relationship with Juliet, even the fact that there's a sort of ensemble cast, and also the structure of the plot where we have these lovers like Midsummer Night's Dream who are not able to be together. In a comedy, that would all be resolved. Of course, it goes in a completely different dark direction here. But I guess maybe there's some overlap in that sense too.
Absolutely. And Romeo and Juliet is a comedy until it's not, in terms of its structure, in terms of its concerns. And it's worth remembering that the labels that we now reach for to describe plays in terms of genre aren't labels that Shakespeare and his audiences were necessarily thinking with.
Right.
They're labels that we often adopt for convenience and because they're there on the front page of the 1623 folio, comedies, tragedies and histories. But actually, plays tend to be much, much more mixed. And if we start thinking about comedy or tragedy in terms of their structure as well, then Romeo and Juliet very much looks like a comedy, as I say, until it's not. So does Othello, come to that.
Another surprising idea. I think you're right. There are moments where there are comic introductions of characters. Some of the lower class characters have these interludes where they appear and there's some comic nonsense between them. And it feels slightly surprising. But I guess it's also part of the entertainment, right, for an audience.
Yeah, and one of the things that we know about the first production of Romeo and Juliet is that the part of Peter, the servant, which is a tiny, tiny part, but it's the servant who accompanies the nurse, it's the servant who has to get Romeo and Benvolio to read the guest list for him. We know that that part was written for Will Kemp, who was the clown in Shakespeare's company. And so he might have been expected to do a bit of improv, to really play to the crowd with that, at the same time as he's playing this small role of Peter in Romeo and Juliet. He's probably also playing Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream. And so that expectation that comes with the actor of a particular kind of comedy. And so he has comic interactions with the musicians, he has comic interactions with the servants. You think maybe there's stuff that didn't ever make it onto the page that might have been physical comedy, that because this particular actor is involved is also very much part of the play as it's performed.
I suppose this would all have leavened the tragedy in some senses as well. Can you tell us now what were the sources for the story of the play of Romeo and Juliet? Because I believe that the tale of Romeo and Juliet was actually pretty well known in Shakespeare's time. Is that right?
It was reasonably well known, it seems, yeah, and it's been known throughout Europe since the Middle Ages, and the Capulets and the Montagues appear in Dante as feuding families, and then gradually it gets fleshed out, so the names Romeo and Julieta are added. There's a French translation in the mid-16th century, but the first English translation is by a man called Arthur Brooke, who calls it The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet, and that's published for the first time in 1562, and then reprinted later on. And we think that Shakespeare knew that version, and also a prose version by a man called William Painter, who translated lots of quite racy Italian stories in 2 volumes of a work called The Palace of Pleasure. And Shakespeare seems to have been reading both of these because he uses the story in his earlier play, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. He echoes some of William Painter's version. So what we see here with Shakespeare using his sources is that he's been thinking about Romeo and Juliet perhaps for quite a long time and reading around it.
Okay, and as ever, it's interesting to look at the sources to see what Shakespeare did with the bare bones of the plot he copied, how he improves it in some sense. So what is different about what Shakespeare does to these sources?
Well, love Arthur Brooke, but he's a terrible poet. If you think about, for instance, the moment where Romeo first sees Juliet and he says, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright." And in Brooke's poem, and I'm going to read a little bit of it out, he says, "This sudden kindled fire in time is wax so great that only death and both their bloods might quench the fiery heat. When Romeo saw himself in this new tempest tossed, where both was hope of pleasant port and danger to be lost, he doubtful scarcely know what countenance to keep. In Lethe's flood his wonted flames were quenched and drenched deep."
I was desperate to stop you earlier there.
It sounds dreadful, doesn't it? So Shakespeare is obviously a much better poet, but perhaps the main change that he makes to Brooke's version is that he radically compresses the time frame. So Brooke has it spread out. They know each other for about 3 months before they get married. It takes quite a long time before Romeo dares to talk to Juliet, whereas Shakespeare does it in 5 days. So that sense of real urgency, as opposed to Brooke's really leisurely story told in terrible poetry.
Okay, I want to come back to that time frame in a minute. I've also understood that Brooke had a quite moralizing message in his version as well, right? That the young lovers were to blame for their fate because they disobeyed their parents and they were overtaken by lustful desires and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Brooke writes a kind of moralizing preface to his 1562 edition. A couple of unfortunate lovers thrilling themselves to unhonest desire, neglecting the authority and advice of parents and friends, conferring their principal counsels with drunken gossips and superstitious friars.
Oh dear.
It's all the bad stuff, and in particular that Juliet uses the excuse of going to confession in order to meet Romeo. That's absolutely beyond the pale for Brooke, or at least his readers.
I know that this may be one of the most familiar of Shakespeare's plots, but I wonder if we could give listeners a very brief reminder who the main characters are and how the plot unfolds.
So as you already noted in your introduction, it's midsummer in Verona, and there's been this feud running between the leading families, which has filtered down even to their servants. We learn that Romeo is madly in love with a woman that we never meet, a woman called Rosaline, and he feels terrible, it's hopeless, she's conveniently unavailable. He tells his cousin Benvolio about this, and Benvolio basically tells him to get a grip. And at the same time, we learn that Capulet is trying to arrange a marriage for his daughter with a young nobleman called Paris, but he wants it to be a kind of future plan rather than immediate. He says that his daughter is too young, but Paris should come along to the party that they're having and meet her anyway. At the same time as that conversation is going on, Benvolio and Romeo have managed to see the guest list to the party, and they see that the mysterious Rosaline is on it. They decide to go to the party to see if Romeo might be able to be distracted from his crush. And Lady Capulet, who's Juliet's mother and Juliet's nurse, Juliet's main confidant, have a conversation with Juliet about the possibility of maybe marrying Paris, or at least seeing what she thinks of him. So it's all quite slow at the start. Nothing is urgent. But at the party, when Benvolio and Romeo and their eccentric friend Mercutio turn up, even though Romeo says he's got a bad feeling about it, Romeo sees Juliet at the party, and it's like a lightning bolt. He manages to talk to her, he holds her hand, and importantly, she seems to want to talk to him too. And they share a sonnet, they kind of write a sonnet together, and they kiss. And she absolutely falls for him. It's like a coup de foudre, an absolute madness that takes them over. And Romeo stays behind when his friends leave, and he manages to get into the Capulets' garden, sees Juliet at her window. They seem to talk to each other for most of the night, declare their love, decide to get married. Romeo manages to arrange the marriage with his friend Friar Lawrence. He thinks it's a terrible idea, but he agrees to marry them because it might just end the family feud. They get married as planned, but immediately afterwards, Romeo and his friends Mercutio and Benvolio have a fight with Juliet's cousin Tybalt, because Tybalt thinks that the Capulets have been insulted by these young men from the Montague family gate-crashing the party. And even though Romeo tries to diffuse the situation with Tybalt, Mercutio wants to fight. And Tybalt kills Mercutio, and then Romeo is completely grief-stricken, and he kills Tybalt. He's banished from Verona on pain of death, but encouraged by the friar and the nurse, he manages to get to Juliet that night. They spend one night together, with Romeo leaving as the dawn breaks. And this is where the pace of it really, really picks up, because Juliet's parents decide that if she marries Paris more or less immediately, it'll distract her from her grief. They think that she's absolutely overcome with grief for Tybalt. They don't know about Romeo, of course. They don't know about the banishment that is the real cause of her grief. And this is the crisis of the play, this projected marriage with Paris within days. So Juliet goes to the friar and says, look, I'd rather die than this. And he says, well, if you're brave enough to die, then why don't you take this drug that makes it look as if you're dead? You'll be put into the Capulet tomb. Romeo can come and be with you when you wake up. But catastrophically, the letter that the friar sends to Mantua, where Romeo has gone, that letter doesn't get through. But the news that Juliet is dead, which is all over Verona, that news gets to Romeo. And so he's absolutely stricken with grief. He buys poison from an apothecary, rides at speed back to Verona, goes to the tomb, kills Paris, who's also there. He's come to lay flowers. And then Romeo takes the poison and dies. And Juliet awakes just after he's died. She refuses help from the friar, and she kills herself with Romeo's dagger. And the parents and the citizens and the prince all gather at the tomb and decide that the feud must end. So that's a whistle-stop version of the plot of Romeo and Juliet.
That's fantastic. Very, very well done. Thank you. So let's talk about this time scale, because one of the most striking features of the whole thing is how fast everything happens. They meet, fall in love, are married, he's banished, they die, all in the space of what? Is it 5 days?
It's 5 days, yeah.
Tell us what Shakespeare's doing with time in this play. Why does he want everything to happen so fast?
I think it's partly the urgency of it, the way that when you are a teenager, you want everything now. You cannot bear to wait. Everything seems urgent and an absolute crisis. But also it's the urgency of theatre, that theatre is always happening now in front of us. And so that sense that we're actually seeing most of it, not quite in real time, but it feels like it sometimes. And I think also that it's set in midsummer. It begins in the middle of July. And so that sense of heat, of short nights and long days. And that's also bringing a kind of urgency to it, that it's too hot to do anything, but at the same time, you want things to happen faster. It's full of mentions of specific times. You know, the clock struck 9 when I did send the nurse, says Juliet, and now it's been 3 hours. What's she been doing? Also, there's this longing for time to speed up because they want things to happen now. So I think that compressed time scheme also adds to the sense of the urgency of being young, of wanting things absolutely desperately, of not being able to wait, of having very, very poor impulse control, as we might say. The compression of time frame means that it's unbelievable.
It is in some ways unbelievable, almost too fast to be credible. The way they fall in love so fast, as you've already said, but also that they decide to be married within an hour or so of meeting each other. And then, of course, things get compressed because events overtake them. Capulet insisting that the wedding with Paris should go ahead, not 2 years from now, but 3 days from now, and then even faster than that. It's amazing that the entire time that they actually spend together could be counted in hours. The current production in London prominently projects the day and time on the upstage wall of the theatre to remind us how fast these things are happening. You mentioned that they want time to speed up, but they also want it to slow down so that they can extend their time together. And there's that sense of them being separate. That time is separate from the real world, of course, that reality will reassert itself. They cannot stop time from rushing forward. They want to speed it up when they're apart, but then slow it down when they're together. But of course, they have no control over it either.
And one of the ways that we can think about speeding up or slowing down time is through poetry. And we're so used now to thinking of ticking clocks. We know how much a second is. We know how long a minute is. But Shakespeare's writing at a time when most people didn't have a clock. let alone a pocket watch. They didn't think about time as passing in seconds. They thought about hours. They thought about days. And so I think the way that poetry, verse in particular, can create a different kind of time becomes much more acute if you don't have that sense of a ticking clock, which of course Rob Icke uses in his production. Nobody was used to having ticking clocks when Shakespeare was writing, but they were used to daybreak, they were used to sunset, and that sense of is it day, is it night? And perhaps if you speak in a particular verse form like a sonnet, you create like a little oasis of time, a little oasis of space in the middle of other ways of thinking about time passing.
Now that's lovely. In fact, you mentioned the dawn and the night. Well, actually, one of the ways to get a handle on the passing of time in the play, it's such a rush, it can be hard to keep track of where we are in time, is that it's a sequence of dawns.
Yeah.
And I found that quite helpful, actually, to get an idea of how this time does elapse. And as you say, the audience in Elizabethan times would be more aware of that. It also creates a sense of a kind of inevitability of what's happening. And I wanted to ask you about that in relation to the prologue, because the play starts with a figure of a chorus giving us a prologue, which is actually pretty explicit about the story that we're about to see.
Yeah.
So why did he write the prologue like that? What was the purpose and effect of the prologue here? Because the play would be very different. You did not know the outcome, and he's given away all the spoilers from the start.
Yeah, it's total spoilers. I mean, I think we can assume that a lot of people knew the plot, as we started off by saying. I mean, most, if not all, plays had prologues. They were absolutely the norm. But most prologues don't survive because they were occasional. That is, they were written for particular performances, particular occasions. And so prologues are kind of detachable. But this prologue, of course, tells us the story. And some of the things that I like about it is that it's a sonnet. And so it introduces that way of thinking about not just poetry, but a particular kind of unit of poetry. But also it's a poem which is full of bodies and violence. It's very violent. It talks about strife. It talks about blood and hands and uncleanness and death. And of course, it introduces the star-crossed lovers. So I think almost the story and giving away the story isn't the point there, but it's giving us a kind of vocabulary to think with, creating a set of markers for the play as it's going to unfold, and creating, I suppose, an ambience as well, whereas we know what's going to happen, so we're going to see how it happens. And that sense of inevitability certainly adds to how the play unfolds.
Yes, there's a sense of dramatic irony through the whole thing that we know the results and those who are living them don't. That sense of inevitability. I was interested, you touched on the language, the poetry creating a different sense of time and space. And it is the poetry, of course, and is one of the most lovely and memorable features of the play, particularly the use of the sonnet. And you mentioned the first time they meet, that their dialogue comes out in the form of a sonnet, which is absolutely remarkable. Can you just remind us, what are the characteristics of a sonnet and why does he use this? What is the effect of this in the play?
So there's a kind of sonnet craze going on when Shakespeare is writing in the 1590s. But the structure of a sonnet, that 14 lines, I think is really interesting because it doesn't divide neatly into two. You don't get two halves of 7 lines. And the verse form that is being used here, both in Shakespeare's blank verse and in a sonnet, iambic pentameter with 5 beats in a line, that doesn't divide neatly into two either. And so the sense of a structure which looks very whole and boxy on the page actually has got a kind of tension in it because it doesn't fall neatly into two. And I think also one of the things about a sonnet structure, whether you divide it up into 3 times 4 plus 2 or 8 plus 6, it's got a kind of propositional logic to it. Often it's about asking a question or saying, here's a situation, how are you going to respond to it? Here's a question, what's your answer? Here's an invitation, what's your response? And so that kind of propositional way of expressing ideas, expressing feelings and emotions, that's very much what Romeo is doing in that sonnet. And one of the things that I love about it is that Juliet recognizes it. And she comes back in the same form. He has his 4 lines, and she comes back with 4 lines. She understands exactly what he's said. And that sense of, oh, we're on the same page. We are actually writing this together is really powerful.
I'll say it's the most fantastic invention. When I discovered this at school, actually, I think I was alerted to this. It's a joy to go back and recognize and reread these lines and the way it's put together. You say it is a proposition, and of course, literally, Romeo is propositioning her.
Yeah.
He wants to kiss her, and it's all on that theme.
Yeah.
And as you say, they complete this thing together. It's the two becoming one in creating the poem together. There's a sort of mirroring going on. And it is a meeting of equals, as you've also alluded to, because she steps up and is as witty and playful and smart as he is in the way this thing unfolds.
Also, sonnets, particularly in the Italian tradition, which is really invented by Petrarch, sonnets are very much about, I want, but I'm never going to get. You're so beautiful, but you're also remote and untouchable, or cruel, or dead, or imaginary. And one of the things that happens in this sonnet that they share is that actually they do touch each other and they do kiss each other. And that sense of, oh, this isn't just about remote, imaginary people. This is about making a space and sharing a space together.
Yeah, you're right. The space is so quiet and gentle and private.
Yeah.
This moment between them within the hubbub of the world around them. And you made this point already that actually creates a sort of separateness to them in time and space, a moment of suspended time, even of ecstasy between them.
Yeah, so the word that we often use to talk about a poetic verse is a stanza, and that's the Italian word for room. So a verse creates a room. And one of the things that I think would have been picked up by an audience when Shakespeare was writing too is that Romeo is a young nobleman, Juliet is a young noble woman. They are both used to taking up space. They're used to having that kind of force field of privilege around them, whether it's Romeo wearing a rapier or Juliet wearing a farthingale, a skirt that takes up space. And so sharing that space with somebody else, reaching out across that space, is particularly powerful if these are characters who, because of their class, are used to being in a kind of force field of privilege. And so when you say, no, come into my room, share my space, that's really powerful.
I love that idea of stanza as space and creating this room together, which they do. Let's talk about some of the characters in more detail and start with Juliet. I think to us, one of the most striking things about Juliet is her age. Shakespeare's very explicit about her age, which he isn't often, I believe.
Yeah.
It states very clearly that she was not yet 14 years old. Why is she so young? Would an Elizabethan audience expect her to fall in love and be married at 13? Or would they, as we do, think they're both way too young to be doing what they're doing?
They would think that very much. So the age of majority for women when Shakespeare was writing was 14, but people didn't marry young. The average age of marriage in the late 16th century is mid to late 20s. Although in London people tended to marry a little bit younger. Yes, there were aristocratic marriages which were often contracted between very young people, but they were for dynastic reasons, and very often they would not actually be solemnized, let alone consummated, until the couple were much, much older.
So why does he make her so young? And she actually does consummate this marriage.
Yeah, I think it makes it more urgent. But I think one of the things that we might say about Juliet's age is that it's less to do with her marriage than to do with her death. That it adds to the pathos of her death and Romeo's age. It's that sense of almost but not quite, which characterizes the play. And that's a pathetic kind of trope of not quite getting to something. Also, if we circle back to what we were just talking about, to be not quite 14 is to be not quite a full sonnet as well.
Oh, very good. Yes, I think you're right that one of the things he's emphasizing is the tragedy in her early death, of the life she has missed out on. She's just on the cusp of beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting from our modern point of view, though. In fact, I believe in Robery Icke's production, he introduces a reference to her being 16.
Yeah, not quite.
And I think perhaps to make the idea of their sexual union more acceptable, because there's no doubt that sex is part of what is driving them, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to the play, but also that there's a deep investment in marriage and this sense that both sex and marriage are important in the play. It matters that they get married, and not just because it makes it right, but because it seems to be participating in a very characteristically late Elizabethan investment in ideas about the importance of love and consent and sex in marriage, which was something that was relatively new, certainly relatively new in the way that it's talked about, for instance, in the marriage service and in the Book of Common Prayer. It's not explicit, but it's there. And one of the reasons that is given for marriage in the prayer book marriage service is that it is for the mutual society and comfort of two people. And that's really important. And I think that sense of society, conversation, getting on with someone, and comfort, physical union, that's radical. That wasn't there in the pre-Reformation marriage service. And so that's part of it, I think, that this is very much speaking to the interest of an audience and pushing against the idea that, well, they've defied their parents, so it's wrong. Actually, in some ways of thinking about marriage and thinking about love, everything that they're doing is right.
That's well said, because you might be tempted to think they just want to get off, and they're allowed to if they get married. But there's more to it than that. In fact, it's interesting you say friend, because at one point Juliet says, "Art thou gone, so love, Lord, I husband, friend."
Yeah.
And of course, it's a match of equals that are able to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And she is very frank about the sexual desire, I think.
Yeah.
When she is formally married, she sees that consummation is part of it, and she's actually desperate for that, so that she is really married.
Yeah.
There's some lines to that effect. Having said that, we don't know exactly how old Romeo is, but I presume he's in his late teens maybe, or not far away. I would suggest not fully formed one way or another at the start of the play. Is that fair?
Yeah. We don't know how old he is. I mean, it's interesting that students always think that they know how old he is. It's nowhere in the text. But he's not fully formed. He's wet. He's mopey. He's a bit unlikable, I think.
Yes.
And one of the things that we get to help us like Romeo and care about him is he's got lovely friends. And that sense that he's got friends who care about him helps, but also that his friends help him to be witty and help him to be funny. And so does Juliet. And that to me is always one of the interesting things about the play, that Benvolio and Mercutio never know about Juliet.
That's sad, isn't it?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think can make a production really successful is that if you look at the way that Juliet and Benvolio in particular are characterized, are performed, and you think, yeah, they'd get on really well. Juliet would fit right in with Romeo's mates.
Mercutio could be more of a challenge.
Mercutio could be more of a challenge.
We'll come to him in a minute, but I do see what you're saying about Benvolio, because he is a solid character, and if he's a good friend to Romeo, then we think more highly of Romeo.
Yeah.
And I think Romeo does grow up to some degree over the course of the play.
He does. It's really striking that when the nurse and Friar Lawrence saying to Romeo, no, you've got to get a grip, you've got to go to Juliet, and then you've got to go to Mantua, and this will get sorted out. And they say, stand and you be a man. They're not saying man up. They're saying you are now a married man and you have to be a grown-up. You have to actually deal with this and own your actions and start acting as a proper social being with a mature identity. And marriage was the sign of social maturity for Shakespeare and his audience, the sort of definition of being a grown-up. And so I think it's really striking that, yes, Juliet addresses Romeo as husband, but he also, particularly in the tomb scene, my love, my wife.
Wife, yes. That's the most heartbreaking, because,
yeah,
again, it signals all of what would have been or could have been to come.
Yeah.
But you're right. And his despair at being banished and separated from her is hugely powerful, as is hers, expressed not long before in very similar terms. And then towards the end, he seems to speak, by comparison to the beginning of the play, where his language is all very performative and orotund, his speech becomes much more resolute and direct, less juvenile, I guess, in some way.
It's a very interesting balance of lines, that Romeo doesn't get his really big soliloquies until almost the end of the play. So he gets his speech in Mantua, where he talks about the dream that he had, and then he has the speech, which is almost always cut, about remembering the apothecary's shop. And then, of course, he gets his great speech in the tomb, And that's his biggest speech in the play. And I think it's one of the great perils for directors and actors. You've got to cast a Romeo who's got enough in the tank to deliver that big final speech.
Yes.
But also, I think it's a really interesting example of Shakespeare as an actor, understanding what it's like to write for an actor who is 2 hours into a play and who is giving his last big speech and working with the actor's tiredness and the actor's wiredness to get that real final adrenaline, that final big push, so that the character and the experience of the actor are actually coming together for Romeo in that moment. This one last effort, this one big aria that he gets in the tomb.
That ties back, I think, to the fact that this is theatre and 2 hours, as it says in the prologue, of compressed action. And that's played out in real time. You mentioned Romeo and his friends. This is very much a male world that this story is set against. Romeo has his mates, and there's all this virility on show and danger on show in these roaming gangs of the Capulets and Montagues. By contrast, Juliet is very isolated, does not have friends around her. Her only confidant is her nurse, as we'll come to, but very much the patriarchy rules in this world. Capulet and Montague are in charge of their households. They're in charge of Juliet and her mother, and they expect them to do what they determine. And yet we have the tenderest of love stories being played out against this background and ultimately, of course, destroyed by it.
Yeah, and I think particularly with the older generation, that sense of Capulet not wanting to lose face with other men. I think this is a situation that would have been very recognisable to many in Shakespeare's audience. Paris has got a title.
Yes.
And Capulet's got the money. And when he says to Juliet, "And you be mine, I'll give you to my friend." This is a business deal. This is about capital and property and inheritance. So on the one hand, there's a deep investment in friendship between men and in men's relationships, whether they are about rivalry or they're about deep friendship or about sort of witty banter. But the flip side of that is this deeply patriarchal but also deeply capitalist world where it's about business relationships and status and not losing face in front of other men.
I think if you look at Capulet's behavior, it can be quite surprising or shocking to us as a modern audiences as to the role of the father. When she disobeys him and says, "I do not want to marry Paris," which he's set up, as you just said, it's a fantastic match as far as he's concerned. Very well respected. He and Lady Capulet praise Paris to the skies. He cannot understand how she could reject this, but also disobey him. He is accustomed to the fact that this is his responsibility. She is his to command. He says as much. He spent his whole life essentially setting this up for her. And for her to turn on that is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And the terms he says it in are unbelievably shocking. She literally threatens to throw her out of the house, that he doesn't care if she hangs or dies or starves in the street. But this is his investment, as you've said. And in the terms of the time and his position, that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, but also, I suppose, Capulet can become a kind of monster. But also, for the sake of the plot, it has to be this extreme. It's also about precipitating the crisis.
That's true.
And so I think there's absolutely a reading of Capulet which is possible where he's got a terrible temper and he's going to simmer down. And he's doing something that he still thinks is for the right reasons, even if he's blown his top and said some terrible things. The point is that emotionally, the damage is done. That Juliet thinks, well, I've got no way out. I have to do this.
Yes. And he does, he's obviously devastated by her death.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to the men and the relationships between them. Male friendship is hugely important, isn't it? The gang of men are closely bound, fiercely protective of each other. And in some productions and interpretations, and I wonder whether you think this is in the text or would have been apparent to an Elizabethan audience, there's some suggestion there could be even a homosexual element to these friendships, whether with Mercutio and Romeo or Benvolio and Romeo or any of them. Is that there, do you think?
I think it can be certainly homoerotic and it's certainly homosocial, but I think it doesn't have to be pushed too far. What matters is that these are men who love each other very much and who are used to relating to each other in sometimes a very bawdy way, a very sexualized way, because that's how young men often talk to each other. And I've seen productions where Mercutio has been in love with Romeo. I've seen productions where Benvolio has been in love with Romeo. And it adds an interesting layer when you sort of go, well, yeah, and they know it and they're okay with it. It's part of this incredible intensity of being young, of having this enormous capacity of love that you want to give to somebody, and it's going to fasten on somebody else. And it might be one of your friends. It might be somebody that you see across a room. It might be somebody that you never meet. But this sense of this deep, deep emotion that needs to go somewhere. And it's going to land in perhaps some unexpected places. And, this is absolutely not downplaying the possibility that a homoerotic reading of those relationships is possible. But I think it's part of this larger sense in the play of young people feel things so deeply and so intensely, and they want to love, and they want to be loved.
That's lovely. I like that. Will Tosh wrote that in the 16th century, intimate friendship between men was routinely praised as the purest and most noble form of human relation, and that may or may not include sex, but I love the idea of love wherever it may fall.
Yeah.
Talking about Mercutio, what does he add to the play, and how would you describe his relationship to Romeo?
So he's actually there in Brooke, but he's nothing like Shakespeare's character. There is a character called Mercutio, and in Brooke, his main characteristic is that when they sit down to dinner at the party, he's on Juliet's other side, and he takes her hand, and he's got terribly cold hands. And so Romeo, who's sitting on her other side, she takes his hand under the table, and he's got lovely warm hands. The sort of origin of Mercutio. But Shakespeare, I think, creates him as a kind of tour de force of a character for a particular actor. We don't know who, but he's got a great set-piece speech in the Queen Mab speech. And one of the things that really interests me about that speech is that I think it's an offcut from Midsummer Night's Dream. I think it's part of this sort of energy and fantastical thinking about fairies, particularly about tiny little things, and about imagination and fantasy that Shakespeare is working on so much in Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think some of that kind of gets copied across into Romeo and Juliet. And
I'm glad you said that, because it's very strange speech, isn't it? Somewhat hallucinatory almost.
Yeah.
To the point that, am I wrong in thinking that even his friends think at some point, he's gone off on one. What's happened to Mercutio? Where is this going?
So I think one of the things that speech is doing, and if we think about what it's like to hear in the theatre, it's full of little descriptions of fantastical things, almost as if he's saying to the audience, picture this, no, picture this, and this, and this, and this. And that effort of imagination that we're being asked to enter into as Mercutio speaks that speech is quite exciting. And it becomes very exciting because it's like you're being asked to imagine tiny things, vivid things, fantastical things. And that effort of imagination, that kind of effort of will, as you almost have these things scrolling in front of your eyes, popping up, it's buzzy, it's exciting, and it's getting the energy going.
Yeah, Mercutio does that. But through that speech, though, does it not turn a bit from, nice fairies to increasingly nightmarish images? And I wonder whether that reflects something about Mercutio's character as well, that he is a bit of a rebel, slightly cynical, maybe disillusioned, maybe unhappy in some way, is he? He seems to be angry. I mean, he talks about Benvolio, his head being full of quarrels, when in fact it looks like he's talking about himself, because he's always on the verge of quarreling about something.
I think within the play, one of the things that Queen Mab speech is doing is establishing Mercutio as the one who doesn't know where to stop, who will talk himself into things and needs to be calmed down, and is a loose cannon. And here it's a wonderful loose cannon. It's like fireworks going off. Dangerous, yes, but wonderful in this effort of imagination.
But it becomes dangerous, doesn't it? Because he basically won't let the taunting with Tybalt lie and goes after him to a terrible conclusion.
Yeah, and I think that sense of who's got the energy in the play, who makes things happen. Mercutio is one of the energy engines of the play for the audience as well as for the plot and for the characters. And so I think Queen Mab, that whole speech for the audience, is a bit like having a glass of champagne, before you go into the party scene, so that when Romeo sees Juliet, goes, "Who's that? She doth teach the torches to burn bright." We're already buzzing too.
Yes, he raises the level of excitement. You're right.
Exactly. And there's going to be music and there's going to be dancing and there's going to be torches. But that language has done a lot of the work as well before we even get there.
He's a great loss to the play, isn't he? We lose him too early, I'd have to say. But it seems in a way kind of inevitable in the structure, in the sense that there's a certain incompatibility between him and the relationship to Romeo and Juliet. So now it's interesting, you talked earlier about how Juliet would have fit in with this gang. In a way, it looks a bit competitive in that sense as well, though. He, of course, says explicitly, Romeo, don't fall in love. Don't mope about and be in love. Love is just for sex, really, and just for good times, and stay with us, be with us. And there's a conflict, an age-old one, that when one of the gang falls for the girl, that takes him away from the gang. And I think Mercutio will miss Romeo in that sense and doesn't want to lose him. Therefore, there may be some conflict. And structurally, of course, that's resolved because he isn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the argument about Romeo has to grow out of hanging around with the boys and grow into a grown-up relationship with Juliet, I think that can be a bit reductive. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to think about the positive side of his relationship with Benvolio and Mercutio, that it's easy to think about relationships between young men as a problem, as something that has to be managed or suppressed. I mean, these guys are hilarious. They're having a great time. They are so fond of each other. They are so funny. They are so witty. Why would you want to stop that?
I just think there's a dark edge to Mercutio that's going to be trouble all the way anyway. And so let's just talk about love in the play as well then, because above anything else, what this play is about is love in its various forms, you said, between men even as well. It's why it's iconic, the relationship between Romeo and Juliet, this exquisite, mad, youthful, deep love that they have. It can be difficult to avoid thinking of Romeo and Juliet's love as adolescent infatuation, given their ages and the haste with which everything happens, bursting with hormones too. But it is so beautifully presented, isn't it? The nervous excitement in their exchanges, the way that they cannot say goodbye, most of all the poetic language, the imagery, the sweet back and forth of their exchanges. We could quote endlessly some of the beautiful poetry that they share in their exchanges together. And also, of course, amongst that is the most famous scene of theater of all time, the balcony scene, so called, and how that is staged, because there is no actual reference in the text to Juliet being on a balcony.
No, the word is unknown in English until the mid-17th century. What matters is that she's above the stage. Later on in the dawn scene, they're described as entering a loft up and at the window. And so in the theatre, the first space that this was performed in, there was probably an opening, a window in the front wall of the tiring house, which was at the back of the stage. And at the curtain, which seems to have looked a little bit more like the globe, perhaps, there seems to have been a gallery over the stage. And so it's that elevation that matters, that Juliet is above Romeo. And in some senses, she should be unattainable, therefore. She's heavenly, she's remote, she's on a pedestal. But of course, she speaks to him and she effaces that distance.
It starts, doesn't it, where he says, "It is the east. The light from her window is the east." And then she does appear, but there is no way that he could be literally climbing up to her in these original productions. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And one of the little details that I love about the first space where this was performed at the theatre in Shoreditch was that the stage, we know from the archaeological excavations, was at the west end of the theatre. So a performance that starts at 2:00 in the afternoon, the audience are going to be looking into the sun as they look up at Juliet on the balcony. But when Romeo says, "It is the east," and Juliet is the sun, it's an example of a kind of transformation. Because she's there, the whole world is going to revolve around her. The audience know that they're looking at the west. They're even having to shade their eyes against the sun. But it's the east because she is now the sun. She is heavenly. She is the object that they're all looking at. And of course it's being performed in daylight, but we're being told that it's the middle of the night, and there she is, this astonishing source of light and life up above the stage. And I think that sense of a kind of vertical separation, this yearning, there's something about the reaching up which seems really, really powerful, and perhaps only just being able to touch hands again, which of course they've already done. So I think it doesn't really matter if they're at a window or she's on a balcony or whatever. What matters is that sense of almost being able to touch, but perhaps not quite. Almost being able to hold hands, but only perhaps being able to touch fingers.
Yes, I was going to say the yearning and the power of the love that potentially he could scale the heights to her. And in fact, he talks about overperching these walls with love's light wings in climbing over into the orchard.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a detail which I don't think I'd really appreciated when the nurse comes to him to confirm the arrangements for meeting to marry. And he says yes, and tells her also that his man will bring a rope ladder to Juliet so that she can let this down for him later that night after their wedding. I don't think I'd picked up on the whole rope ladder before.
Yeah, well, it doesn't get staged very often because it looks a bit silly, but that's a detail that he takes out of William Paynter, actually, from the source. And where it does turn up and is absolutely central to the plot is in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, where there is a rope ladder and it becomes a source of great comedy. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about these staging issues is that while now we're so used to seeing the dawn scene as the lovers waking up together, we're used to seeing them in bed together. Actually, Shakespeare doesn't stage that. He has them appear aloft together. And first of all, that's about Romeo being lifted up. He has been aloft with Juliet. But also that their marriage, their bed, remains private, that we don't have to see it, that it's something that's just for them until we see them together in the tomb. That's where we see them lie down together. And so that sense of something which is so intimate, so private, that it is going to be confined to night and to poetry until the very, very end of the play, when we get this terrible travesty of it, when they are finally together in death.
Yes, and we also get it through their language in the aftermath, in a sense. The way they can't part, she won't let him go, and he almost stays, knowing that if he stays, he dies. The language is fantastic. And that just reminds me that the nature of the love, if you think it starts as an adolescent excess or infatuation, I think sonnet itself initially establishes that it's more serious than that. There's an intensity, a tenderness, a depth to this love. And the language raises it, enshrines its iconic power, I think. As the friar says, they do not love moderately.
They do not.
No. Hester, we've talked about Juliet's father's role in governing what happens to her, insisting that she marry Paris and threatening to disown her if she disobeys him. And I wanted to ask you about the role that her mother, Lady Capulet, plays, and then the nurse in her life. While modern audiences may be surprised by Juliet's father's attack on her, and it can seem very harsh, so her mother's complicity in backing him up can also seem cruel.
Yeah, I think it can, and I think this is something which often comes out in performance, and there are a lot of choices that can be made around the age of Lady Capulet.
Ah, yes.
If a production chooses to play that character very young, for instance, the sense that she has no power in the household is important, but also if she's closer to Juliet in age and recognises a situation that perhaps she herself was in. Lady Capulet is the example of the sort of character where a production can make particular interesting choices and think about her dynamic not just as a mother but also as a wife. It's interesting that there's been a fashion, perhaps starting with Zeffirelli, perhaps earlier, for suggesting that Lady Capulet is having an affair with Tybalt. And that is a way of fleshing out a character who perhaps can seem quite one note on the page, of giving her a kind of emotional and psychological hinterland. I don't think there's anything in the text that would justify that, but I can absolutely see why directors and actors make that decision, because it gives a rather underwritten character a bit more to do.
Is that something also to do potentially with her age? Is there something in the text that suggests she's much younger than her husband?
No, but I think if we think about the dynamics of the company, that particular age range of maternal aged women is hard when you've got teenage boys playing all the women's parts. And so it's striking that you don't get very many female characters in, say, their 40s until the second half of Shakespeare's career. And so playing her young is something that might actually be easier for a boy to do, rather than giving a kind of simulacrum of middle age.
Okay, I think that makes sense anyway, in terms of her behavior and attitude to Juliet at this moment, because if she was, in a sense, a child bride, then that's all she's known.
Yeah.
And also she's in a position, as you say, where she is obeying her husband as well, because that's what she does.
Yes, and she says explicitly that she was Juliet's mother by the time she was almost Juliet's age, or not much older than Juliet is.
Exactly. Speaking of being Juliet's mother, for much of the play, the nurse appears to be more maternal with Juliet than her own mother. We don't see a lot of interplay between Juliet and her own mother, but we do see a lot between her and the nurse. But
Yes.
that also takes a turn at the sticking point. But through most of it, she's a confidant, isn't she? And a buttress, even against her parents. But I wanted to ask you what happens in the arc of the nurse's relationship with Juliet, because initially she does everything to facilitate her and Romeo's meeting and marrying. But then at the crucial moment, she advises her to marry Paris. And that leads to a rupture between them. I mean, where does that come from?
I think it's a sign of the nurse's limitations socially. It's partly about class, that she conceives women's role in terms of marriage and motherhood, and that's what you've got to hang on to. And therefore, if Romeo isn't there, then it makes sense for the nurse, for Juliet to secure her future by obeying her parents, marrying Paris, making the best of it. That's what the nurse has had to do in her own life. She has had to make the best of things. And her world is smaller than Juliet's because she is of a lower social class.
Yeah, there's a suggestion, isn't there, that she lost her own daughter who would have been about the same age as Juliet.
Yes, and that's a situation that would be very familiar to an early modern audience, that the nurse has been Juliet's wet nurse, and you become a wet nurse if you lose your own baby. And it's interesting that there is this little moment in that speech before the nurse becomes particularly comic. It's as if she opens a window to another life. Susan and she were of an age, but Susan is with God. Ah, well, she was too good for me. And there is this little lost child, this little ghost baby, who is briefly brought to bear and adds a particular psychological and emotional colour to the play, which I think remains, and it bookends, as it were, Capulet's comment in his first exchange with Paris when he says of Juliet, "Earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she," that the Capulets too have lost children. So already within the world of the play, there are children who have died, and we know that by the end of the play, other children will have died too. These little sort of brushstrokes of pain and past grief, which are there already within the world of the play, waiting, as it were, to be animated again.
Yeah, that's really good because you pick up on that reference and you do feel for the nurse. And it also, to some degree, must inform her attachment to Juliet as well.
Very much.
As a substitute daughter in some way.
Yeah. There's a moment at the point of her rupture with Juliet, which is one of my absolute favourite moments. And it's not in the text that is usually used. It's in the first quarto of the play. So Romeo and Juliet's text is published twice in early editions, and the 1599 second quarto is the one that's most familiar. It's the one that's the basis for most performances. But the 1597 quarto has some interesting little bits. And one of the bits that it has is that at the beginning of the scene where Juliet is about to take the potion, in the text as we have it, she just says to the nurse, "Aye, those attires are best. Leave me by myself tonight. I need to sleep, I need to pray, go and sit up with my mother." And the nurse doesn't say anything. In the first quarto of the play, printed in 1597, the nurse says to Juliet, "Are you sure there isn't anything I can do?" I paraphrase. And then she says, "Well, there's a clean smock under your pillow, and so good night."
Oh.
And I think that's the most astonishing little insight from a character who knows that something is deeply wrong and who can't quite put a finger on it and isn't in a position to say, "What's going on? Can I help? Do you want to run away? Do you want me to try to get this marriage stopped?" all she can do is care. And the way that she can care is to say, well, you've got a clean nightie. Get as much sleep as you can.
That's really nice. I think that kind of lessens the impact of her actually telling Juliet, no, you must marry Paris. And of course, she does that for practical reasons. Yeah, she believes Romeo is not going to make it back.
Yeah.
But she also, I think there's an element, perhaps I wondered, when she witnesses where Capulet literally threatens to evict his daughter, to send her out onto the street, disown her completely, then to some degree, perhaps reality hits that they will both be out on the street.
Yeah.
And Juliet obviously needs to come back into line. There's no future that way.
Yeah.
But I love that point because she's incredibly protective of Juliet. And originally she warns Romeo that he better treat her right. Then she initially defends her against Capulet. But obviously the reality is overtaken. Continuing with the role of the adults in the fate of the couple, I wanted to ask you about the role of Friar Lawrence, what part he plays in the tragic plot. We think of him for most of the play as a good guy, I suppose, because he has sympathy and helps Romeo and Juliet, though he also takes some pretty crazy risks, marrying them in secret without their parents' approval, not to mention the plan with Juliet's mock death potion, which, of course, we all know is going to go terribly wrong. What do we make of his agency in the plot?
I think he's a really interesting character, again, to think of in terms of age. Is he of the parental generation? Or if he's played much younger, if he's the kind of cool priest who runs the parish football team and who is perhaps not that much older than the boys whom he's been teaching, and a bit like the nurse, it's how much authority does he have? How much power does he have? He's got the authority of his position, but maybe actually within Verona, he too is subject to the will of other people, including these powerful families. And I think once one starts to think of him as perhaps not having much power, then the decisions that he makes look even dafter.
Yes.
He absolutely means the best, but he makes terrible choices. He does want the best for these characters, and I'm always moved by the intimacy and the care of his relationship with Romeo, that there is real affection there, real respect there. But as with the nurse, it's got limitations. It can only go so far. And ultimately, the advice that he gives, it's bad advice.
Yes. It feels like he's overstepping the mark from the start when he marries them without the parents' knowledge. But he has an idea that somehow this will force the houses to make peace between themselves. It seems a little far-fetched and a big risk to take, as you say, stepping beyond whatever power he has. But I also wanted to ask you, I was a little bit disconcerted by the end of the play, and we're going to talk about the end in a minute. But his behavior, he reappears at the end in the tomb, and Romeo is already dead. He's just missed him. He's too late. And he is there when Juliet awakes, and he tells Juliet that Romeo is dead and bids her to come away with him. He will sequester her in a nunnery, he says. But she rejects that. And then he himself flees.
Yeah.
He's disturbed. He hears people coming and he flees. And I think, what's going on there? Where's he going?
I think it's a dramatist going, actually, I just need to get rid of everybody.
Okay.
And he's set up this plot where the friar is coming back. And then he realizes, no, have to get rid of the friar. Because what matters is it's just the two of them at the end, and that Juliet has to die, and she has to do it quickly.
So let's talk about the ending then, because I'm wondering whether to interpret that the friar had sort of bolted when he thought, I'm in trouble here.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a bit of that maybe, but also there are many productions that the friar doesn't even reappear at this point. I was surprised when I reread the text that he was there, because more often than not, as you say, you just see the two of them. So can we talk about how this ending actually plays out? Because I think there are differences between the way it's written and the way it's often played.
Yeah.
And I've started by what I think happens in the text. Romeo dies before any sign that Juliet lives. Juliet awakens, and the friar tells Juliet that Romeo is dead, and then he goes and she kills herself with Romeo's dagger. But there are variations to that. Can you talk us through some of those variations, and how do you feel about which the best way to stage this is?
Yeah, so the ending of the play is one of the most messed around bits of it, and for very, very good reasons, I think. It's really, really common for directors to find a lot of cuts in the last scene, to cut the friar completely, as you've just suggested, to cut Paris completely from the last scene, which is quite common and which I think is a much bigger decision actually than cutting the friar.
Yes, just to remind us, because actually Paris has arrived at the tomb to bring flowers, and he runs into Romeo, and he takes exception to Romeo being there and challenges him, and Romeo kills him, which is a big development.
Yeah, so one of the advantages of cutting Paris is that Romeo isn't a double murderer. It's theatrically simpler because one of the great problems historically that directors have seen with that last scene is that it begins outside the tomb and then ends in the tomb, and the action is continuous. So in the 18th and 19th century tradition, they had to try to work out a way of actually staging it. And in the late 19th century, with great actor managers like Henry Irving, they would actually put a complete scene change in between so that you would have the scene outside in the churchyard, and then they would completely change the scenery, have a completely new set, and you would be, as it were, in the crypt, in the vault under the church. Modern audiences are not going to put up with that, and so making lots of cuts gets rid of those problems. In the 18th century, starting with the actor David Garrick, there was a long tradition of Romeo taking the poison and then Juliet waking up before he died. And so that tradition extends all the way through into the 21st century. We can see the residue of it, where, as it were, that the knife gets turned, whether or not they actually exchange words or see each other or have a last live embrace and kiss. And you can see that it really, really ramps up the pathos, the idea that Romeo is about to die and realises that he's made a terrible mistake, and Juliet knows that he is about to die, and they have this final farewell. I think that's not trusting the play. I don't think you need that. It's already terrible enough. It's already been full of enough near misses. You don't need another version of it. It's bad enough when Juliet says, "Thy lips are warm."
Yes, I was going to say that's those details where Romeo says that her lips and cheeks are crimson. Obviously, we know that she's not dead. And the same in reverse, so to speak, when she kisses Romeo's lips, hoping that some of the poison remains there, she finds thy lips are warm. As you say, if there's no awareness on either side, those two things land even more strongly. But they can play it not necessarily where they're both aware. So there was a production I've seen where Romeo, as he's dying, sees that Juliet moves, and he realizes she's alive, but he dies before she awakes, and so she doesn't see him alive. And I thought that was very powerful, too.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that we're so used to characters taking poison in Renaissance drama, but the whole reason why poison is great on the stage is that it allows the moment of death to be uncertain and certain at the same time. It's a sort of delayed action. So death by poison is great drama.
That's a great point. It reminds me that there was a production at the Almeida Theatre here in London which enacted the death scenes in a more realistic way, possibly, than I've ever seen. Firstly, the poison that Romeo takes induced horrible, painful contortions. And then Juliet had to take some time to gird herself, to stab herself, because if you think in reality, what would it take to have the energy, propulsion, to be able to penetrate yourself with this dagger? It was more visceral and real, certainly, than the romanticized endings, as you say, with poison can just take as long and have very little effect, and you just go to sleep.
Yeah, I think one of the things that feeds into how we might imagine the ending of Romeo and Juliet is also the operatic tradition and the ballet tradition, where you want to have a final duet. If you think about the ballet tradition of Romeo and Juliet, the terrible, beautiful pas de deux, where Romeo tries to dance with Juliet's body. And it's so inappropriate and so beautiful. But all of those then become part of the longer dramatic and emotional tradition of the play.
Well, one of the things that often is cut, and I'm not sure that I don't disagree with this, is the aftermath. So they die, and then there's this great summing up, as Shakespeare often does, where all of the cast reappear and everybody has to be told exactly what's gone on. The friar comes back and tells his story, and so everybody knows exactly how this has all come about. And to us in modern terms, it seems pretty anticlimactic. Isn't it better to just leave the last word to the lovers?
I think probably in modern idioms, yes. I don't think we've got the rhetorical and listening capability now to listen to that kind of very static narrative, telling us stuff that we all know already because we saw it. But I think there are arguments, at least critically, for retaining all of that. One of them is that we have to watch the other characters realising what's happened, particularly the Capulet parents. They don't know what's happened. And I think it can be extraordinarily effective if the nurse arrives. She's not there on the page, but if she's brought back on the stage, it's terrible. If Benvolio is there, now in the first quarto, we're told that Benvolio is dead because clearly the actor is having to double another character. But if Benvolio is there, realising that this has happened, and how did he not know? But I think also one of the strange effects of hearing the friar try to tell the story and try to put some order onto this chaotic, passionate, rushed story is that it's both adequate and inadequate. Here we are actually watching a story being assembled for the first time, trying to give it a shape, trying to give it a meaning. And it's necessarily going to fall short because what we're looking at as we hear that story is the bodies of the characters and the bodies of the actors. And that sense of, well, this cannot ever be adequate. This cannot ever do justice to what's just happened because the friar doesn't know everything. The only people who saw almost everything are the audience. And it's a moment where we have to sit with that knowledge.
Well, he does a very clear, if prosaic, but a very clear summary. But we know all that. So it can't but come across as somewhat inadequate to the emotional register.
Yeah, but I think that inadequacy is almost part of the effect of it. And particularly, if we might think of the friar's story as being like a version of the golden statues that the fathers promise. It's always going to be an inadequate form of art. Now, here, have a story, have a golden statue. It's the best we can do, but it's no way compensation for the beauty that's been lost.
Yeah. Of course, the important fact that comes out of this summing up is that the two houses declare peace.
Hooray! Hooray!
Yeah, it's not enough. Thank you, Hester. I've learned so much talking to you about this wonderful play. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guest to recommend another play, one that we might cover in the podcast, but really it's just one that's a personal favorite that you'd like to share with me and our listeners. Have you got a play that you just love?
Am I allowed to have two?
Oh my goodness, the cheek.
I think that they are plays that are really interesting to think about next to Romeo and Juliet. One of them is The Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Okay.
I'm editing at the moment for the Arden Shakespeare. And it shares sources with Romeo and Juliet. It's very early in Shakespeare's career. And in some ways it's not very good. It's messy. It's about two friends who fall in love with the same woman. And it's about being very young and very stupid and making bad choices. But it's a comedy. And nobody dies. And it all works out in the end. And even better than that, it has a dog in it. It has the wonderful Crab the dog and some brilliant comedy with the dog.
I've never seen that play, so it would be great if someone put it on and we could talk about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole premise of two men falling in love with the same woman sounds pretty good.
It's really common. It's the much more common story in Renaissance drama than we might think from Shakespeare. He only does it in Two Gents of Verona and at the other end of his career in The Two Noble Kinsmen. But the other play, which I do love very much, is John Ford's 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, which dates from about 1632, and it riffs on Romeo and Juliet. It takes the Romeo and Juliet situation in that you have a bourgeois family in an Italian town, in this case it's in Parma, and a whole bunch of suitors who are wanting to marry this beautiful young woman. It has a friar, it has a nurse, but the difference is that the young man who is in love, who is called Giovanni, is in love with his sister called Annabella. So it is the incest play, but it keeps riffing on Romeo and Juliet. It has a balcony scene. It has bits in it which are clearly versions of Shakespeare's play. And one of the things that it does is that everybody else in the play is so corrupt and so horrible that actually you think, well, this incestuous relationship, I mean, it's terrible, but comparatively speaking, it looks okay. So in terms of a decadent moral relativism, it's a really, really interesting play to see what happens for an audience, 40 years after Shakespeare's play, when they clearly know Shakespeare's play. But what if you make it much crazier? What if you turn it into a kind of moral experiment? And notoriously, and this is probably not a spoiler for anybody who knows anything about Ford's 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, at the very end of the play, Giovanni kills his sister Annabella, who by that stage is pregnant with his child and married to somebody else, and cuts out her heart and appears with it at a banquet with the heart stuck on his dagger. So it's everything that you've ever heard about the decadence of Jacobean and Caroline tragedy and then some. But it's a great play.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Actually, it's on my list. I really want to do this sometime, and you've just sold it again. So we'll have to come back together, Hester, and do that one too. Thank you so much for those recommendations. They're brilliant. If you are in or near London and wish to be reminded of the beauty and power of Romeo and Juliet, Robery Icke's production continues at the Harold Pinter Theatre until the 20th of June, 2026. So, as the curtain falls on the doomed lovers, some cynical part of us can be tempted to think of Romeo and Juliet's sudden passion as immature infatuation, their falling so readily for each other, and their rash compulsion to marry, maddening in its naive recklessness. But who can really resist Shakespeare's profoundly poetic rendering of the all-consuming power of first love? Although Romeo and Juliet's fate is a tragedy, what lives on is the play's iconic legacy, is the beauty and fierceness of their love, something that we're all touched by or even dream of knowing. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.